Have you ever wondered what it was really like when our ancestors went to war? Not the sanitized version from history books, not the romanticized Hollywood battle scenes, but the raw, primal brutality of human conflict when survival meant everything and mercy meant death. Tonight, we're diving deep into one of the most visceral chapters of human existence, a time when warfare wasn't about flags or nations or ideologies, but about something far more fundamental. This is the story of caveman wars, and trust me, what you're about to discover will shatter everything you think you know about primitive combat. Whether you're listening to this at 2 a.m. unable to sleep, driving through empty highways, or just trying to understand how we became the species we are today, settle in, because this isn't just history. It's the blood-soaked foundation of everything that came after. If you're new here, welcome to the kind of content that digs deeper than the surface, that asks the uncomfortable questions, and doesn't look away from the brutal answers. And if you've been here before, you know we don't do shallow. We go to the places where textbooks fear to tread. Now before we begin, let me be clear about what we're really talking about here. When I say caveman wars, I'm not talking about cartoon Neanderthals bonking each other with clubs. We're talking about sophisticated, calculating, utterly ruthless conflicts between groups of early humans who had developed warfare into an art form long before they ever thought to write down their rules of engagement. These weren't random skirmishes or accidental violence. These were systematic, organized campaigns of destruction that would make modern military strategists pause in recognition. And here's what's going to shock you, what's going to keep you awake tonight thinking about it. The archaeological evidence suggests that prehistoric warfare was proportionally more deadly, more total, and more psychologically devastating than anything we've seen in recorded history. Think about that for a moment. More brutal than the trenches of World War I, more total than the carpet bombings of World War II, more psychologically scarring than Vietnam. And it happened not with machine guns or poison gas or napalm, but with stones and sticks and the kind of intimate personal violence that requires you to look your enemy in the eye as you end their life. But here's where it gets really disturbing, where the story takes a turn that most people aren't prepared for. These weren't wars fought between strangers, between distant tribes who had never met. The genetic evidence, the archaeological patterns, the bone fragments we've dug up from massacre sites across Europe, Africa, and Asia tell a different story entirely. These were wars fought between neighbors, between groups who had traded with each other, intermarried, shared resources during hard times. These were civil wars, in the truest sense, brother against brother, cousin against cousin, played out with a savagery that defies comprehension. Picture this. You're living 30,000 years ago. Your band of maybe 40 people has occupied the same river valley for generations. You know every tree, every game trail, every seasonal pattern. The next valley over, maybe a day's walk through the forest, lives another group. Your groups have known each other for decades. You've traded flint for hides, shared information about mammoth migrations, even exchanged marriage partners. But then something changes. Maybe the climate shifts and game becomes scarce. Maybe a particularly harsh winter kills off too much of the local wildlife. Maybe disease sweeps through one group, leaving them weakened and desperate. Or maybe, just maybe, one charismatic leader starts whispering that the only way forward is to take what the others have. What happens next isn't a fair fight between warriors following some ancient code of honor. It's not even a battle in any sense we'd recognize. It's an extermination campaign designed not just to defeat the enemy, but to erase them so completely that they never pose a threat again. And this is where the archaeology gets truly horrifying, where we start to understand just how calculated and systematic prehistoric warfare really was. Because when these conflicts erupted, when neighbor turned against neighbor, the goal wasn't conquest. It wasn't tribute or surrender or negotiated peace. The goal was annihilation. Let me paint you a picture of what this looked like. based on the evidence we've uncovered from sites across the globe. The attackers wouldn't announce themselves. They wouldn't issue challenges or demands. They would wait, watch, learn the patterns of their targets. When did they sleep? When did they hunt? When were they most vulnerable? Then, in the pre-dawn darkness, when the human body is at its weakest, when reflexes are slowest and awareness is dimmed, they would strike. Not with the thunderous charge of medieval knights or the disciplined advance of Roman legions, but with the silent, deadly efficiency of apex predators. The weapons weren't crude. That's another myth we need to destroy right now. These people had been perfecting the art of killing for thousands of years. Their spear points were works of engineering genius, designed not just to penetrate, but to cause maximum internal damage. Their clubs weren't random branches. They were carefully weighted and balanced instruments of destruction. Their arrows weren't simple sticks with sharpened ends. They were precisely crafted projectiles that could punch through hide and bone with devastating effect. But the weapons, as sophisticated as they were, weren't the most terrifying part. The most terrifying part was the planning, the coordination, the cold calculation that went into these attacks. Archaeological evidence from sites like Crow Creek in South Dakota, Talheim in Germany, and Avnet Cave in Bavaria shows us something that should chill you to the bone. These weren't heat-of-the-moment conflicts. These weren't spontaneous eruptions of violence. These were carefully orchestrated massacres that required weeks, maybe months of preparation. The attackers had to scout their targets, plan their approach routes, coordinate their timing, and prepare for what came after the killing was done. And what came after was perhaps the most brutal part of all. Because victory in prehistoric warfare didn't just mean defeating your enemies, it meant erasing them. Not just the warriors, not just the men of fighting age, but everyone, the elderly, who carried the group's memories and stories, the women who bore the next generation, the children who represented the future. The bone evidence tells a story that's almost too horrible to process. Skulls crushed by multiple blows, bones bearing the marks of systematic torture, evidence of cannibalism, not for sustenance, but for psychological warfare, for the complete dehumanization of the enemy. Mass graves, where entire family groups were buried together, their bodies showing signs of coordinated, ritualized killing. This wasn't random violence. This wasn't the result of individual psychopaths or momentary breakdowns in social order. This was organized, systematic, culturally sanctioned genocide, and it was happening all across the prehistoric world on a scale that makes modern ethnic cleansing look restrained by comparison. But here's what really should keep you up at night. What should make you question everything you think you know about human nature. This wasn't aberrant behavior. This wasn't some deviation from the human norm. This was the norm, for thousands of years, for hundreds of generations. This level of organized brutality was just how our species settled disputes. The evidence is overwhelming, and it's global. From the Americas to Africa, from Europe to Asia, wherever we find concentrations of prehistoric human remains, we find the same patterns, the same evidence of systematic massacre, the same bone modifications that speak to torture and ritualized killing, the same mass graves that tell of entire communities wiped out in single coordinated attacks. And the numbers, when you really crunch them, when you look at the statistical reality of prehistoric violence, are staggering. Some researchers estimate that up to 60% of all prehistoric deaths were violent deaths, not from disease, not from accidents, not from old age, but from deliberate human violence. Think about that. In some prehistoric societies, your chances of dying violently at the hands of another human were better than your chances of dying from any other cause. War wasn't something that happened occasionally, during times of particular stress or resource scarcity. War was the default state of human existence. But why? What drove our ancestors to this level of systematic brutality? What turned neighbors into exterminators, trading partners into torturers, fellow humans into something less than animals? The answer lies in the mathematics of survival. in the cold calculus that governed every decision in a world without safety nets, without law enforcement, without any guarantee that tomorrow would come. In the prehistoric world, there was no such thing as a small conflict. Every dispute, every disagreement, every competition for resources carried the potential for total annihilation. Imagine living in a world where your entire extended family, your entire cultural universe, consisted of maybe 200 people scattered across a handful of camps, where the difference between a good year and a catastrophic year might be a single successful mammoth hunt, where winter wasn't just cold, it was a months-long dance with starvation that claimed the weak, the unlucky, and the unprepared. In that world, the group in the next valley over wasn't just competition. They were an existential threat. Their success meant your potential failure. Their survival might mean your extinction. And so the logic became horrifyingly simple. Them or us. No middle ground. No compromise. No mercy. The archaeological record shows us just how far this logic extended. At sites like Herxheim in Germany, we find evidence of something that defies every comfortable assumption about prehistoric life. Not just warfare, not just massacre, but systematic processing of human remains that speaks to a level of dehumanization that's almost incomprehensible. Bodies dismembered with the same careful precision used to butcher animals. Bones cracked open to extract marrow, skulls turned into drinking bowls. This wasn't the result of starvation or desperation. This was ritual, ceremony, the complete transformation of human beings into objects, into resources, into trophies. And it wasn't rare. Sites across Europe show similar patterns. The same methodical processing, the same ritualized violence, the same evidence of communities that had developed systematic approaches to not just killing their enemies, but to erasing their humanity entirely. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of prehistoric warfare wasn't the violence itself, but the social structures that made it possible, because this level of coordinated brutality doesn't happen spontaneously. It requires organization, leadership, planning, and most importantly, it requires a culture that can produce killers. The bone evidence tells us about the victims, but what about the perpetrators? What kind of social system produces warriors capable of systematic genocide? What kind of training? What kind of psychological conditioning? What kind of cultural indoctrination turns a human being into someone who can methodically torture children to death? The answer is both simpler and more disturbing than you might expect. These weren't special forces. These weren't elite warriors separated from the general population. These were ordinary people, hunters and gatherers, who could track a deer through thick forest, who could read weather patterns and find water in a drought, who could craft tools of incredible precision and beauty. The same hands that carved delicate bone needles for sewing also shaped spear points designed to maximize internal bleeding. The same minds that could memorize the movements of stars across seasons could also plan coordinated attacks that left no survivors. The same social bonds that held communities together in times of peace could be weaponized in times of war to create killing machines of terrifying efficiency. And here's where the story gets even darker, where we start to understand that prehistoric warfare wasn't just about resource competition or territorial disputes. It was about something much more fundamental, something that cuts to the very core of what makes us human. The evidence suggests that these conflicts often had a ritual component, a spiritual dimension that went far beyond mere survival. The systematic destruction of enemy dead, the careful arrangement of remains, the evidence of ceremonial consumption, all point to warfare as a form of religious practice, a way of interacting with supernatural forces that governed life and death. In many prehistoric societies, killing wasn't just a practical necessity. It was a sacred act. Warriors weren't just fighters. They were priests of violence, intermediaries between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The battlefield wasn't just a place where disputes were settled. It was a temple where blood offerings were made to gods whose names we'll never know. This transforms our understanding of prehistoric violence in profound ways. We're not talking about desperate people driven to extremes by circumstance. We're talking about societies that had integrated systematic killing into their fundamental worldview, that had made genocide not just acceptable, but holy. The bone modifications found at massacre sites often show patterns that go far beyond what would be necessary for simple killing, or even for intimidating enemies. They show evidence of careful ritual attention, of time spent with the dead, in ways that suggest complex ceremonial practices surrounding warfare and death. Scalping, for instance, wasn't just a way of taking trophies. It was a spiritual practice, a way of claiming not just the life of an enemy, but their power, their essence, their connection to the spirit world. The careful removal of specific bones, the arrangement of remains in particular patterns, the evidence of post-mortem rituals, all speak to warfare as a form of supernatural practice. But the ritual aspects of prehistoric warfare reveal something even more unsettling about our ancestors. They suggest that the capacity for systematic violence wasn't something that had to be learned or developed in response to particular circumstances. It was something that was already there, already integrated into the basic structure of human society, already encoded into our understanding of how the world worked. The same communities that could create beautiful cave paintings, that could craft intricate tools, that could develop complex systems of kinship and trade, could also turn that creativity, that technical skill, that social organization toward the systematic destruction of other human beings. And they did it not with reluctance or regret, but with the same careful attention to detail, the same pride in craftsmanship, the same cultural sophistication that they brought to every other aspect of their lives. The evidence suggests that for many prehistoric societies, warfare wasn't something that interrupted normal life. It was normal life. This raises questions that should fundamentally challenge how we think about human nature, about civilization, about the very foundations of the world we've built. Because if systematic genocide was normal for our ancestors, if organized brutality was just another aspect of daily life, then what does that say about us? What does that say about the thin veneer of civilization that separates our world from theirs? The uncomfortable truth is that the capacity for the kind of systematic violence we see in the prehistoric record didn't disappear with the invention of agriculture, or the rise of cities, or the development of written law. It's still there, still part of our genetic inheritance, still waiting beneath the surface of our carefully constructed social order. The archaeological evidence from sites like Jebel Sahaba in Sudan reveals something that should make your skin crawl. Dating back over 13,000 years, this cemetery contains the remains of 59 individuals. And here's the terrifying part. Nearly half show clear evidence of violent death, but not quick, merciful deaths. These people died slowly, painfully, with multiple wounds inflicted over time. The skeletons tell a story of systematic torture that lasted hours, maybe days. Stone points embedded in spines, in skulls, in the bones of children who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. Some victims have over 20 separate injury sites, each one carefully placed to maximize pain while keeping the victim alive as long as possible. But Jebel Sahaba isn't unique. It's just one piece of a global puzzle that reveals the true scope of prehistoric brutality. At Ovnet Cave in Bavaria, archaeologists discovered something that defies every comfortable assumption about our ancestors. Dozens of human skulls, carefully arranged in ritual patterns. But here's the detail that should haunt you. Most of these skulls belonged to women and children. The men were missing. Not because they weren't killed, but because their bodies were disposed of elsewhere. Probably fed to animals or scattered to prevent proper burial. The women and children were kept, processed, their skulls turned into ceremonial objects that served as permanent reminders of the attacker's power. This pattern repeats across continents, across millennia. In North America, the Crow Creek site in South Dakota preserves evidence of a massacre that claimed nearly 500 lives in a single coordinated attack. But the kill sites aren't what's most disturbing. It's what happened after the killing stopped. The bodies were left to rot in the sun for months before being hastily buried in a mass grave. This wasn't about disposal or hygiene. This was about psychological warfare, about sending a message to anyone who might discover the site. The message was simple. This is what happens to our enemies. This is what we're capable of. This is what awaits you if you cross us. The bone analysis from Crow Creek reveals something even more chilling. The attackers didn't just kill indiscriminately. They targeted specific individuals first. The elderly, the disabled, anyone who might carry cultural knowledge or serve as a spiritual leader. Then they worked their way through the population systematically, saving the strongest for last so they could witness the destruction of everything they held dear. But physical violence was only one dimension of prehistoric warfare. The psychological component was equally sophisticated, equally brutal, and far more lasting in its effects. Because unlike modern conflicts, where soldiers can return to civilian life, where the battlefield is separated from the home front, prehistoric warfare consumed entire communities, entire ways of life. Imagine being one of the few survivors of such an attack. Everyone you've ever known is dead. Your parents, your siblings, your children, your friends, all butchered in a single night of coordinated violence. But you're not just a survivor, you're a witness. You've seen things that no human being should ever see. You carry memories that will poison every quiet moment for the rest of your life. And there's nowhere to go for help. No counselors, no support groups, no medication to dull the psychological pain. You're alone with your trauma in a world where showing weakness means death, where the only way to survive is to find another group that will accept you and hope they never decide you're more trouble than you're worth. The genetic evidence suggests that this kind of trauma was endemic in prehistoric populations. Studies of ancient DNA reveal patterns of population collapse and recovery that speak to cycles of violence so systematic, so complete, that entire lineages were wiped out repeatedly throughout human prehistory. But here's where the story becomes truly disturbing, where we start to understand that prehistoric warfare wasn't just about survival, or resources, or territory. It was about something much darker, something that reveals aspects of human nature we'd prefer not to acknowledge. The evidence suggests that many of these conflicts were fought not out of necessity, but out of choice. Not because resources were genuinely scarce, but because taking resources from others was easier than developing them independently. Not because territory was limited, but because controlling territory gave groups power over their neighbors. Archaeological analysis of prehistoric massacre sites reveals patterns that contradict the narrative of desperate people driven to violence by circumstances beyond their control. Many of these attacks occurred during periods of relative abundance, when environmental conditions were stable, when there was no obvious external pressure forcing conflict. The Talheim massacre in Germany, for instance, occurred during a period when agricultural communities were flourishing, when population was growing, when there's no evidence of resource stress or environmental catastrophe. 34 people, including children as young as 2 years old, were systematically beaten to death with carefully crafted stone axes. The attackers took time with their work. The bone evidence shows that victims were struck repeatedly, far more than would have been necessary for simple killing. This was torture, prolonged and deliberate, carried out not in the heat of battle, but with cold, methodical precision. And the most disturbing detail of all, the attackers were neighbors. Genetic analysis suggests the perpetrators and victims belonged to related groups, people who had lived in the same region for generations, who shared common ancestors, who had probably intermarried and traded and cooperated for decades before the violence erupted. This wasn't warfare between strangers, or foreigners, or fundamentally different peoples. This was civil war in its most literal sense, communities turning against themselves, with a savagery that defies explanation. But it wasn't random or spontaneous. The coordination required for these attacks, the planning, the systematic nature of the violence, all suggest that prehistoric societies had developed cultural mechanisms for transforming neighbors into enemies, for making genocide not just possible, but inevitable. The process appears to have involved what anthropologists call ritual dehumanization, systematic practices designed to psychologically prepare warriors for mass killing. Evidence from cave art and burial practices suggests that many prehistoric societies had developed elaborate ceremonies designed to transform ordinary hunters into sacred warriors, people whose role was not just to fight, but to serve as instruments of divine vengeance. These weren't soldiers in any modern sense. They were more like priests of violence, individuals who had undergone psychological conditioning so complete, so thorough, that they could torture children to death while believing they were performing a sacred duty. The cave paintings at sites like Lascaux and Altamira show not just hunting scenes, but elaborate ritual preparations for warfare, ceremonies designed to invoke spiritual power and prepare warriors for the psychological demands of systematic killing. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of prehistoric warfare was its efficiency. These weren't clumsy, disorganized conflicts. They were precisely coordinated military operations that would impress modern strategists with their sophistication and ruthless effectiveness. The attack patterns preserved in the archaeological record show evidence of reconnaissance, of intelligence gathering, of careful timing, designed to maximize casualties while minimizing risk to the attackers. Sites like Herxheim show evidence of coordinated assaults involving dozens of warriors attacking from multiple directions simultaneously, using terrain and weather conditions to maximum advantage. The weapons weren't crude either. Prehistoric warriors had access to an arsenal that was specifically designed for killing humans, not hunting animals. Specialized war clubs waited for maximum skull-crushing impact, spear points with barbs designed to lodge in flesh and cause massive internal bleeding when removed, arrows tipped with poisons that could kill in minutes. But the most sophisticated weapon in the prehistoric arsenal wasn't made of stone or wood or bone. It was fear. The psychological warfare component of prehistoric conflicts was so advanced, so systematic, that it often eliminated the need for actual violence. The mere threat of what might happen was enough to cause entire communities to abandon their territories, to scatter into the wilderness, to choose exile over the possibility of facing the kind of ritualized brutality that had become the signature of prehistoric warfare. The bone evidence tells us about the victims who didn't escape, but the genetic evidence tells us about the ones who did. Population genetics reveals patterns of sudden migration, of communities abandoning territories they had occupied for centuries, of lineages disappearing from entire regions only to reappear hundreds of miles away, generations later. These weren't gradual migrations in search of better hunting grounds or more favorable climate. These were refugee movements, desperate flights from violence so systematic, so total, that entire peoples chose to abandon everything they had ever known rather than face the possibility of ritual extermination. And the refugees carried their trauma with them. Genetic studies suggest that populations that survived prehistoric massacres developed heightened stress responses, increased aggression, enhanced capacity for violence that could be passed down through generations. The survivors didn't just escape the killing, they internalized it, made it part of their genetic inheritance, their cultural DNA. This creates a feedback loop that helps explain why prehistoric violence was so persistent, so endemic. Each generation of survivors was more violent, more paranoid, more capable of systematic brutality than the last. The communities that survived were the ones that could outkill their neighbors, that could be more ruthless, more efficient, more completely merciless than anyone who might threaten them. The archaeological record shows this escalation clearly. Early prehistoric violence was relatively simple: clubs, stones, basic spears. But as millennia passed, the technology became more sophisticated, the tactics more complex, the ritual components more elaborate. It was an arms race, not just of weapons, but of cruelty. Each generation trying to develop new ways of inflicting maximum psychological trauma on their enemies. By the end of the prehistoric period, Warfare had evolved into something that would be recognizable to modern military strategists. Coordinated attacks involving hundreds of warriors, siege tactics designed to starve out defenders, psychological operations aimed at breaking enemy morale before battle was even joined, intelligence networks that could track enemy movements across vast distances. But unlike modern warfare, prehistoric conflicts retain their ritual character, their spiritual dimension, their function as a form of communication with supernatural forces. Warriors didn't just fight, they performed. Battles weren't just tactical exercises, they were ceremonies. Violence wasn't just practical, it was sacred. And the most sacred violence of all was reserved for the end, for the moment when victory was assured and the real work could begin. Because winning the battle was just the beginning. What came after was the systematic destruction of everything that had made the enemy human. The bone modifications found at prehistoric massacre sites reveal a level of post-mortem violence that serves no practical purpose. Bodies dismembered long after death, bones arranged in ritual patterns, evidence of ceremonies that could last for days, elaborate processes of transformation that turned human remains into objects of power, into talismans, into permanent reminders of what happened to those who dared to resist. This wasn't just about killing enemies. This was about erasing them, about making sure that nothing remained of their culture, their memory, their existence. It was genocide, not just in the physical sense, but in the spiritual sense, the complete obliteration of everything that had made a people who they were. And it worked. The genetic record shows us the results. Lineages that simply disappear from the human family tree. Entire populations that vanish without trace. Cultures that left no descendants, no stories, no memory of who they were or what they believed or how they lived. The efficiency of this erasure is what should truly terrify you. Because these weren't random acts of violence or crimes of passion. These were calculated operations designed to achieve specific strategic objectives, and they worked with a precision that would make modern military planners envious. Consider the mathematics of prehistoric genocide. A typical hunter-gatherer band consisted of maybe 30 to 50 individuals. Kill 20 of them, and you've crippled the group's ability to hunt, to defend itself, to maintain the complex social bonds that held the community together. Kill 30, and you've essentially guaranteed that the survivors will scatter, that their cultural knowledge will fragment, that their lineage will fade into obscurity within a generation or two. But prehistoric warriors understood something even more sophisticated than simple population mathematics. They understood the psychology of collective trauma, the way that witnessing extreme violence could shatter not just individuals, but entire social structures. The bone evidence suggests that attackers deliberately chose their targets for maximum psychological impact. The elderly were killed first, not because they posed a physical threat, but because they were the repositories of cultural memory. They carried the stories, the genealogies, the spiritual knowledge that defined group identity. Eliminate them, and you've severed the community's connection to its past, its understanding of who they are and where they came from. Children were often tortured in front of their parents, not out of sadism, but as a form of psychological warfare designed to break the will of adult defenders. The message was clear. Surrender now, and your death will be quick. Resist, and watch everything you love suffer before you die. And the methods of killing weren't random either. Archaeological analysis reveals that prehistoric warriors had developed specialized techniques for different categories of victims. Warriors died from direct trauma to the head or chest, quick deaths that acknowledged their status as fellow fighters. But non-combatants faced something far worse. The bone modifications on women and children show evidence of prolonged torture, of deaths that were drawn out over hours or even days. Not because prehistoric warriors were naturally cruel, but because they understood that the screams of the innocent would carry farther than any war cry, that the memory of what happened to the helpless would haunt survivor communities for generations. This psychological dimension of prehistoric warfare reveals something deeply disturbing about human nature. Our ancestors weren't just capable of violence. They were capable of calculated cruelty, of systematic torture, designed not for any practical purpose, but purely to maximize the suffering of their enemies. They had weaponized empathy itself, turned the bonds of love and family into instruments of warfare. The evidence from sites like Schöneck-Killenstetten in Germany shows us just how sophisticated this psychological warfare had become. 7,000 years ago, attackers didn't just kill their enemies, they staged elaborate displays of the aftermath. Bodies were arranged in specific patterns. Remains were modified in ways that would maximize the horror for anyone who discovered the site. But here's what's truly chilling about these discoveries. They weren't one-off events. The same patterns appear at sites across Europe, across continents, across millennia. This wasn't the work of isolated psychopaths or aberrant communities. This was standard operating procedure, the normal way that prehistoric societies conducted warfare. And it was effective. Genetic studies show that communities that survived prehistoric conflicts were those that could project the most credible threat of extreme violence. The groups that thrived weren't necessarily the strongest or the most numerous. They were the ones with the most terrifying reputations, the ones whose very name could cause enemy communities to flee rather than fight. This created a selection pressure that favored not just physical prowess, but psychological ruthlessness. The communities that survived were those that could produce warriors capable of the kind of systematic cruelty that would break enemy morale before battle was even joined. Generation after generation, the genetic and cultural traits that enabled extreme violence were reinforced, amplified, passed down as survival skills. But the most disturbing aspect of prehistoric warfare wasn't the violence itself. It was how normalized it became. Archaeological evidence suggests that many prehistoric societies built their entire social structure around the assumption of constant warfare. Children were raised from birth to be either warriors or victims. Social roles were defined by their relationship to violence. Even art and religion were shaped by the omnipresent reality of organized killing. The cave paintings at sites like Cueva de la Araña in Spain don't just show hunting scenes. They show battle preparations, warrior initiations, ritual scenes that glorify violence and death. These weren't aberrant expressions of a violent minority. They were mainstream cultural productions that reflected the values and priorities of entire societies. Children grew up surrounded by weapons, by the tools of war, by constant reminders that their survival depended on their ability to kill their neighbors more efficiently than their neighbors could kill them. Play involved mock battles, training exercises, psychological conditioning designed to prepare young minds for the realities of prehistoric warfare. The bone evidence tells us about the physical consequences of this system. But what about the psychological toll? What kind of mental state would be required to participate in systematic genocide, to torture children, to turn neighbors into objects of ritualized violence? Modern psychology gives us some clues. Studies of contemporary warriors, of soldiers who have participated in ethnic cleansing or genocide, reveal consistent patterns of psychological adaptation. Normal human empathy doesn't disappear. It gets redirected, focused on the in-group while the out-group is systematically dehumanized. Prehistoric societies appear to have developed cultural mechanisms for managing this psychological challenge. Ritual practices that allowed warriors to compartmentalize their violence, to separate their identity as community members from their role as instruments of destruction. Ceremonies that transformed ordinary people into sacred killers. Individuals whose capacity for extreme violence was not just tolerated, but celebrated. The archaeological record shows evidence of these transformation rituals. Special burial practices for warriors, distinctive grave goods that marked them as different from ordinary community members. Cave art that depicts figures who appear to be part human, part supernatural being. These weren't just fighters. They were spiritual intermediaries, people who had crossed the line between the world of the living and the world of the dead. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of prehistoric warrior culture was its sustainability. These weren't desperate measures adopted during times of crisis. They were stable social institutions that persisted for thousands of years. Communities that could produce systematic killers generation after generation, that could maintain the psychological and cultural infrastructure necessary for organized genocide across centuries. The genetic evidence suggests that this system was so deeply embedded in prehistoric society that it shaped human evolution itself. Populations that survived were those with higher baseline levels of aggression, enhanced stress responses, improved capacity for coordinated violence. The gentle, the peaceful, the naturally empathetic were systematically eliminated, their genetic contributions removed from the human gene pool. This has profound implications for understanding modern human nature. The capacity for extreme violence that we see erupting in contemporary conflicts isn't an aberration, it's an inheritance. The psychological mechanisms that enable genocide, ethnic cleansing, systematic torture, they're not learned behaviors that can be easily unlearned. They're part of our evolutionary heritage. The archaeological record from the Mesolithic period shows this evolutionary pressure intensifying. As populations grew and territories became more contested, the level of violence escalated accordingly. Sites like Skateholm in Sweden reveal evidence of communities that had essentially militarized their entire social structure. Everyone was either a warrior or warrior support, either a killer or someone whose role was to enable killing. The bone modifications from this period show increasing sophistication in torture techniques, more elaborate ritual practices surrounding warfare, evidence of communities that had turned systematic violence into a form of high art. These weren't desperate survivors clinging to existence. These were thriving societies that had discovered that organized brutality could be not just an effective survival strategy, but a source of cultural identity and spiritual meaning. And the violence wasn't episodic. It wasn't something that happened during times of particular stress or resource scarcity. The dating of massacre sites shows that prehistoric warfare was continuous, endemic, a permanent feature of the social landscape. Communities lived in a state of constant readiness for violence, always prepared to either launch an attack or defend against one. This created a feedback loop that made peace impossible. Any community that tried to opt out of the cycle of violence, that attempted to develop more cooperative social structures, would quickly find itself at a fatal disadvantage. The only way to survive in a world of systematic killers was to become systematic killers yourself, to match and exceed the brutality of your neighbors. The psychological toll of living in such a world is almost impossible to imagine. Every stranger was a potential threat. Every neighboring community was a possible source of annihilation. Sleep was dangerous. Isolation was deadly. Trust was a luxury that could get you killed. The baseline stress levels required to survive in such an environment would be considered pathological by modern standards. Yet this was normal life for our ancestors. This was the world that shaped human consciousness for tens of thousands of years. The hypervigilance, the capacity for instant violence, the ability to dehumanize others completely. These weren't aberrant traits developed by a few disturbed individuals. They were species-wide adaptations that enabled survival in a world where systematic genocide was the default method of conflict resolution. The evidence from sites like Nataruk in Kenya, dating to about 10,000 years ago, shows us the final evolution of prehistoric warfare. 27 individuals, including pregnant women and children, systematically executed with weapons that had no purpose other than killing humans. The attackers used specialized war clubs, arrows with obsidian points, and techniques that maximize suffering while ensuring death. But what's most disturbing about Netaruk isn't the evidence of violence itself, it's the evidence of ceremony. The bodies were arranged in ritual patterns. The wounds showed signs of post-mortem modification, and there were clear indications that the killing had been accompanied by elaborate spiritual practices. This wasn't just murder, it was sacrifice, a religious act performed by people who believed they were serving divine purposes through systematic brutality. The transition from prehistoric to historic warfare didn't represent a reduction in violence. It represented a change in organization, the same psychological mechanisms, the same capacity for systematic cruelty, the same spiritual dimension of organized killing. All of these elements persisted into the historic period. They just became institutionalized, professionalized, scaled up to match the larger populations and more complex societies that were emerging. But the essential nature of human warfare, the psychological and spiritual foundations that make systematic violence possible, these were established during the prehistoric period. Everything that came after, from the Bronze Age warrior cultures to modern military organizations, was built on foundations that were laid by our hunter-gatherer ancestors. The uncomfortable truth is that the capacity for extreme organized violence isn't something we learned. It's something we inherited. It's written into our genetic code, embedded in our neural architecture, encoded in the deepest structures of human psychology. The thin veneer of civilization that separates us from our prehistoric ancestors isn't as thick as we like to pretend. And under the right circumstances, with the right pressures and the right cultural permission, that prehistoric capacity for systematic brutality can reemerge with terrifying speed. The 20th century showed us just how quickly civilized societies can revert to the kind of organized genocide that was routine for our ancestors. The archaeological record of prehistoric warfare isn't just a window into the distant past. It's a mirror that reflects aspects of human nature we'd prefer not to acknowledge. It shows us what we're capable of when the social constraints that normally govern behavior break down, when the psychological mechanisms that enable extreme violence are given cultural permission to operate. But there's one more dimension to this story that we haven't fully explored yet. One aspect of prehistoric warfare that's even more disturbing than the violence itself, because the evidence suggests that our ancestors didn't just kill their enemies, they absorbed them, incorporated them, made them part of themselves, in ways that blur the line between warfare and transformation. The evidence of this absorption comes from bone analysis that reveals something almost too disturbing to process. At sites across prehistoric Europe and Africa, we find human remains that show clear signs of systematic processing, but not for disposal, for consumption, for integration into the bodies of the victors. This wasn't cannibalism driven by starvation. This was ritual incorporation of enemy flesh, enemy blood, enemy bone marrow. The cut marks on these ancient skeletons follow specific patterns, techniques that were passed down through generations, refined over centuries into precise procedures for transforming human beings into spiritual and physical nourishment. The skull modifications, found at sites like Goff's Cave in England, tell a story that should fundamentally alter how we think about prehistoric identity. These weren't just trophies, they were drinking vessels, carefully crafted bowls made from the craniums of defeated enemies. But here's the detail that should make your skin crawl. The bone analysis shows these skull cups were used repeatedly. Imagine the psychological reality of drinking from your enemy's skull. Every meal becomes a ritual reminder of your victory, your dominance, your capacity for total annihilation. But it's more than just psychological warfare against the dead. It's transformation of the living, a systematic process of making enemy identity part of your own. The genetic evidence supports this disturbing interpretation. DNA analysis of prehistoric populations shows patterns that are consistent with systematic absorption of conquered groups. Not just the killing of enemies, but the literal incorporation of their genetic material, their bloodlines, their hereditary traits into the conquering population. This wasn't rape in the conventional sense. Though sexual violence was certainly part of the pattern, this was something more calculated, more systematic. Breeding programs designed to extract useful genetic traits from conquered populations, while eliminating everything else that made them who they were. The bone chemistry tells us about diet, about migration patterns, about the physical realities of prehistoric life, but it also tells us about identity transformation on a scale that's almost incomprehensible. Populations that absorb the calcium from enemy bones, the proteins from enemy flesh, the minerals from enemy blood, communities that literally built themselves from the bodies of their victims. But the absorption wasn't just physical. The archaeological record shows evidence of cultural cannibalism as well. The systematic appropriation of enemy technologies, enemy artistic styles, enemy spiritual practices, not through trade or peaceful exchange, but through conquest and forced integration. Cave paintings from the later prehistoric period show artistic styles that appear to be composites, combinations of techniques and symbolic systems that originally belonged to different groups. But the dating of these sites suggests they weren't created through cultural exchange. They were created after one group had systematically eliminated another and appropriated their artistic traditions. The same pattern appears in tool technology. Sophisticated techniques for working stone, for crafting weapons, for processing animal remains. These innovations spread not through peaceful diffusion, but through conquest and absorption. The communities that survived were those that could not just kill their enemies, but learn from them, incorporate their knowledge, make their innovations part of their own cultural toolkit. This creates a picture of prehistoric warfare that's even more disturbing than simple genocide, because genocide at least preserves the humanity of the victims, recognizes them as people who existed, who had their own identity, who were destroyed but not erased. But absorption is different. Absorption denies the victims' independent existence, transforms them into raw material for the conquering group's expansion. The evidence from sites like Herxheim shows this process in horrifying detail. Hundreds of individuals from multiple groups systematically processed, not just for killing, but for integration. Bones cracked open and the marrow extracted, skulls modified into vessels, long bones turned into tools, but also evidence of ceremony, of ritual practices that transformed the act of consumption into something sacred. This wasn't just about nutrition or resource utilization. This was about spiritual transformation, about the belief that consuming your enemies could transfer their power, their knowledge, their essential qualities to yourself. It was warfare as a form of evolution, systematic killing as a method of genetic and cultural improvement. The psychological implications are staggering. What kind of mental state would be required to participate in the systematic processing of human beings for consumption? What kind of cultural framework could make such practices not just acceptable, but sacred? Modern anthropology gives us some clues through studies of societies that practiced ritual cannibalism into the historic period. The psychological mechanisms involve a complete restructuring of empathy, a redefinition of humanity that excludes the target group so completely that they become indistinguishable from animals or raw materials. But prehistoric absorption appears to have gone even further. The evidence suggests that some communities developed the ability to move fluidly between seeing enemies as human and seeing them as resources, depending on tactical requirements. They could negotiate with a group one season and systematically process them for consumption the next, without any apparent psychological contradiction. This flexibility, this ability to rapidly shift between different modes of relating to other humans, may have been one of the key evolutionary advantages that allowed certain prehistoric populations to dominate their neighbors. They weren't constrained by consistent moral frameworks or stable definitions of humanity. They could adapt their psychology to match their strategic needs. The bone isotope analysis from sites across prehistoric Europe reveals the geographic scope of this absorption. Individuals whose childhood diet markers indicate they grew up hundreds of kilometers away in completely different ecological zones, but whose adult diet markers show they were fully integrated into local communities by the time they died. But here's the disturbing detail. Many of these individuals show evidence of violent death. They weren't refugees who had been peacefully adopted. They were captives who had been forced to integrate, who had spent years or even decades living among the people who had destroyed their original communities. Imagine the psychological reality of such existence. You're one of the few survivors of a massacre that claimed everyone you ever loved. But instead of being killed, you're absorbed into the enemy community. You're forced to participate in their rituals, to adopt their customs, to raise children who will never know your original culture existed. And the most chilling part of all, the evidence suggests that many of these absorbed individuals eventually became active participants in raids against other communities. The same isotope markers that reveal their foreign origins also show they were present at sites where other groups were massacred and processed. The victims became perpetrators. The absorbed became absorbers. It was a cycle of transformation that turned warfare into a mechanism for continuous cultural evolution, a system where identity itself became a fluid, conquerable resource. This understanding transforms how we think about prehistoric conflict. It wasn't just about territory or resources, or even simple survival. It was about the fundamental nature of human identity, about who gets to exist as a distinct people and who gets absorbed into something else entirely. The genetic legacy of this absorption is written into modern human populations. DNA studies reveal that virtually every contemporary ethnic group carries the genetic signatures of prehistoric conquest and integration. We are all, in a very literal sense, the products of systematic absorption, the descendants of both predators and prey. But the cultural legacy is even more profound. The psychological mechanisms that made prehistoric absorption possible, the ability to rapidly redefine the boundaries of humanity based on strategic needs. These capacities didn't disappear with the invention of agriculture or the rise of civilization. They're still there, still part of our evolutionary inheritance, still waiting beneath the surface of our carefully constructed social identities. The same mental flexibility that allowed our ancestors to transform enemies into resources can be activated by the right circumstances, the right pressures, the right cultural permission. And when those mechanisms do activate, when the constraints of civilization break down enough to allow our prehistoric psychology to operate freely, the results look remarkably similar to what we see in the archaeological record: systematic dehumanization, ritualized violence, the transformation of enemies into objects, the absorption of conquered peoples into expanding imperial identities. The uncomfortable truth is that the capacity for this kind of systematic absorption isn't something we've evolved beyond. It's something we've temporarily suppressed, held in check by social institutions and cultural norms that could collapse under the right pressures. The archaeological record of prehistoric warfare isn't just a window into our distant past. It's a preview of what we're capable of becoming again, a reminder that the thin veneer of civilization that separates us from our ancestors is exactly that: thin, fragile, and entirely dependent on circumstances that we may not be able to control forever. Because in the end, what the bones tell us isn't just about what our ancestors did to each other. It's about what we are, what we've always been, and what we could become again if the world ever pushes us back to that primal edge where survival means everything and mercy means extinction. The fire that burned in prehistoric camps, the same fire that lit the faces of warriors preparing for systematic slaughter, that fire never went out. It's still burning, still waiting, still ready to consume everything we think we've built. If we ever forget the lessons written in blood and bone across 100,000 years of human warfare, sweet dreams.